It was a quiet morning in the city. The sky was clear, and the sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm golden light over the tall buildings. People were starting their day, unaware that something huge was about to change everything. The world, as they knew it, was about to be thrown into chaos. The first sign was a deep rumble, a sound so loud it felt like the ground itself was shaking. Cars rattled in their places, windows vibrated in their frames, and the air seemed to thrum with something unnatural. At first, people thought it was just a minor earthquake, something they had grown used to living in a city near fault lines. But this wasn't just an earthquake. This was something much, much worse. It started in the distance, far beyond the skyline, where the towering buildings seemed to tremble in fear. People stopped in their tracks, looking up at the sky. It was hard to tell at first, but then they saw something moving. Huge, massive, so big that it blocked out the sun as it passed over the city. At first, it seemed like a dark cloud, but it wasn't a cloud. It was something alive. The Warbeast had arrived. The creature was immense, towering over the tallest buildings. Its body was made of jagged stone-like armor, covered in glowing cracks where molten fire flickered beneath the surface. Its eyes were red, fierce, burning, with an intensity that could scare anyone who looked at them. And its claws huge, sharp, and ready to tear through anything in its path. As it walked forward, the ground shuddered with each step. The beast's weight seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. People ran, terrified, as they saw the enormous creature's head rise over the city skyline. The air was filled with a loud, deafening roar that sent waves of fear through the crowd. The sound was like nothing anyone had ever heard before, as if the beast itself was announcing its arrival. Emergency alarms blared across the city, but no one knew what to do. The military was called in immediately, but even they weren't prepared for what they were facing. Helicopters soared into the sky, and tanks rumbled into position, their weapons ready to fire. The streets filled with people running in panic, looking for shelter, and the military began launching their best weapons at the beast, trying to stop it. Nothing worked. The Warbeast was unstoppable. Missiles exploded against its thick stone-like hide, but they had no effect. The beast roared again, shaking the ground with its anger. Fire poured from its body, lighting up the city in waves. The destruction seemed to spread in every direction, as though nothing could stand in its way. In the city's center, a group of soldiers opened fire, but the Warbeast simply turned its head and stared at them. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, it charged forward, knocking over buildings as if they were made of paper. Screams filled the air, but no one could stop it. People could only watch in horror as the beast's enormous form moved closer, its fiery eyes fixed on its next target. The military tried to regroup, but the Warbeast seemed to know their every move. Each attack was met with unfathomable strength. Tanks were crushed, jets were destroyed, and buildings collapsed as though they were toys. It was clear that no matter how powerful the weapons were, they were no match for the Warbeast. The city was quickly becoming a war zone. Smoke billowed from the wreckage of buildings, and fires raged in every direction. The air was thick with dust and ash, and the sound of destruction was deafening. People in the streets ran for their lives, some crying out for help, others simply running in blind terror, unsure where to go or what to do. And yet, even in the midst of all this destruction, there was something else, something that didn't make sense. In the far corner of the battlefield, standing alone against the Warbeast, was a small figure, a child, no more than 10 years old. The child stood there, eyes fixed on the Warbeast, unmoving, unaffected by the chaos around them. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They didn't look scared. The small child, in the middle of an apocalyptic scene, stood as if they knew something everyone else did not. Their eyes, though calm, held a power that none of the soldiers, nor the beast itself, could have ever imagined. It was as though they were waiting for something to happen, waiting for the world to change. As the Warbeast's fiery eyes locked onto the child, the creature slowed. For just a second, it hesitated. Something about the child's presence seemed to command its attention. The Warbeast's enormous claws dug into the ground, and its roar died down, replaced by a strange, unsettling silence. What was this child? Why were they standing so boldly, while the rest of the world was fleeing in fear? Was this child the key to defeating the Warbeast? Was there more to this story than anyone had imagined? The city waited for an answer. The Warbeast, unstoppable by any force on earth, had come. But it was the child, standing alone against it, that everyone was watching now. What would happen next? The streets were chaos. Dust swirled in the air as a massive storm of fire and destruction filled the sky. People screamed, running through the shattered remnants of what had once been a bustling city. The Warbeast towered over everything, its body of stone and molten fire unstoppable. The creature's every movement shook the ground beneath its feet, and the terrifying roar it released echoed through the city. It was an apocalypse in real time, unfolding with no way to stop it. The military, the greatest defense humanity had ever built, was powerless. Missiles fired at the Warbeast exploded uselessly upon impact, as if the beast's stone armor was impervious to everything thrown at it. The streets, once filled with life and movement, were now deathly quiet in spots, with the sounds of gunfire and explosions punctuating the eerie silence that followed the Warbeast's movements. Soldiers, armed to the teeth, stood in frozen shock, staring at the destruction all around them. It was as though the world was on pause, its future uncertain. They watched helplessly as the beast continued its relentless march, pushing aside buildings, crumbling structures, and entire streets as though they were mere obstacles. The Warbeast didn't stop. It didn't flinch. It simply moved forward, the earth itself trembling with every step. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, in the heart of the battlefield where the destruction seemed most intense, something strange was happening. The Warbeast, for all its power, paused. Its molten eyes, blazing red, shifted their gaze from the decimated skyline to a figure standing in its path. The child, the small human child, barely 10 years old, stood there alone, unmoving. She was nothing but a speck in comparison to the gigantic Warbeast, but in her stillness, she radiated an undeniable aura, something that made even the monstrous creature hesitate. The soldiers, who had been firing and shouting just moments before, now stared in disbelief. How could a single child stand in the path of such devastation and remain untouched? The Warbeast, in its fury, had obliterated entire military divisions. But now it faced something it hadn't expected: a human child with the courage to stand unshaken. Before it, the scene was surreal. The child's face was calm, her expression a quiet confidence that seemed to defy the madness around her. Her hands were at her sides, not gripping a weapon, not holding anything at all. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. A sense of quiet tension filled the air as the child and the Warbeast locked eyes. The wind shifted, stirring the debris in the streets, but nothing else moved. The Warbeast's claws dug deep into the ground as if it were preparing for something, unsure of what this new challenge could be. Its eyes flickered briefly, its massive frame shifting slightly as though it had never encountered a being with such determination. This was a creature that had taken down entire armies, ravaged cities, and crushed anything that dared to stand in its way. And yet here was a small child, standing tall against it, without a hint of fear. The child's silence spoke volumes. It was clear now that this was no accident, no random moment of defiance. There was something about this child, a presence that was unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. As they looked on, it wasn't just the child's courage that struck them. It was her sheer power, something invisible but undeniable, radiating from her very being. This wasn't an ordinary child. This wasn't someone afraid of the Warbeast. No, this was someone chosen. Someone who held a key to something far greater than any of them understood. In the distance, the alien woman stood, watching intently. Her eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, seemed to understand exactly what was happening. She did not move, but her presence was like a weight on the air, immense, steady, and full of purpose. It was as if she knew the Warbeast would hesitate at the child's presence, as if this moment had been destined. The soldiers, some still holding their breath, didn't dare to speak. This was beyond their comprehension. For what felt like an eternity, the two child and beast stared at one another. The tension was thick, and every breath seemed to echo through the deserted streets. The Warbeast, unable to comprehend what it was facing, released a low growl, a sound that made the air vibrate with menace. Its eyes burned with rage, and its massive body began to shift, preparing to move again. But the child did not flinch. She remained where she stood, her gaze never wavering from the beast's fiery eyes. The beast's growl grew louder, but still, the child was unmoving. There was a moment of complete stillness. Then, suddenly, the beast stopped. It was as though something had frozen it in place. For a long moment, everything was silent. No one moved. The Warbeast, the child, the soldiers, the alien woman, all were locked in this strange, impossible moment. And then, the child raised her hand, slowly, deliberately, as if she were about to do something that no one expected. The soldiers, still watching in awe, felt a surge of energy and electricity in the air, as though the world was holding its breath. The alien woman's gaze intensified. She knew what was about to happen, and it sent a shiver through her. But the soldiers couldn't even imagine it. How could a child, with no weapon, no training, do anything to stop a creature like the Warbeast? But the child was doing something. They could feel it. The Warbeast, which had once been unstoppable, now hesitated, its enormous form towering over the city, trembling slightly as the child's calm, quiet presence pushed it to the edge. The beast was waiting for something, and the world waited with it. What would the child do next? The suspense was unbearable. The city held its breath. The Warbeast stood still, its gargantuan form casting a shadow over the wreckage of the city. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the faint sound of the wind sifting through the debris. People around the city were frozen in terror, watching from every angle as the child stood there, the smallest thing in the world compared to the towering creature. How could someone so small stand up to something so massive? The world held its breath. The child didn't move, didn't blink. Her expression was one of calm certainty, as though she were simply waiting for something that had already been set in motion, long before the Warbeast arrived. But for everyone watching, it was impossible to understand. How could a child be so unshaken in the face of destruction? The soldiers, their weapons still raised, stared at her in disbelief. They had trained for years to face danger, to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet here was a child, barely old enough to understand the danger around her, facing the deadliest of monsters with not an ounce of fear. The Warbeast had obliterated entire battalions, shattered the city, and destroyed everything in its path. But this girl, she was standing tall, completely composed, as though she had the power to stop it. There was a strange energy in the air, an unnatural calm that hung between the child and the beast. It was like an invisible force, pulling at the very fabric of reality. The soldiers could feel it in their bones, a strange weight pressing on their shoulders, making them uneasy. The tension between the child and the Warbeast was so thick that even the air seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the world itself was waiting for something monumental to happen. The Warbeast growled again, a deep rumble that reverberated through the streets, its molten eyes fixed on the child, narrowing, as if trying to understand what it was facing. The creature's size alone should have been enough to terrify anyone. But there was something about the child that made the Warbeast hesitate. It had never faced anything like this before. The alien woman, who had been watching from a distance, took a single step forward. Her eyes gleamed with a mix of awe and recognition. She knew something the soldiers didn't, something they couldn't possibly understand. The child wasn't just standing there out of bravery. There was something deeper at play. The child had a power of force that even the Warbeast, with all its might, could not overcome. The woman knew this because she had seen it before. She had seen what this child could do, even though no one else had. But why? Why this child? Why now? And what was this mysterious power that had brought her here, standing before the greatest threat humanity had ever faced? The world held its breath again. The Warbeast, despite its fearsome power, was confused. It had crushed entire cities before, devoured entire armies, but it had never had to face a force like this. Its massive body shifted, restless. The child, though still small in comparison, had an aura that made the creature wary. It could sense something powerful in her. It wasn't just her presence, it was as though she was commanding the very air around her, shaping reality itself. The Warbeast roared in frustration, its monstrous body shaking with fury, but it didn't attack. It couldn't. The soldiers, still caught between awe and fear, whispered amongst themselves, "What's happening? One of them muttered under his breath, "Why isn't it attacking? Is it waiting for something?" Another soldier whispered, his voice trembling, "What kind of power does this child have?" But no one had the answer. They couldn't understand. How could they? There were no words in any military manual to explain this. No training could prepare them for a moment like this. As the Warbeast stood, confused but still dangerous, the alien woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the child. She could feel the energy pulsing in the air, the power building, slowly, like the calm before a storm. She took another step, her movements deliberate, each step calculated. It was as if she knew exactly what was about to happen. She knew this child was more than just a symbol of hope. This child was a force of nature, one that had been chosen for something far greater than anyone could imagine. Then, the child moved, slowly, gently. She raised her hand, palm facing the Warbeast, and for the first time, the beast didn't react. It hesitated, staring at her with an intensity that could melt steel. The soldiers watched, eyes wide, hearts racing. They had seen the Warbeast take down entire buildings in a single swipe. They had witnessed it tear through armies as if they were nothing more than ants. But now the creature was standing still, facing this child as if it were afraid. The child's hand trembled slightly, but she held it up, steady, unwavering. There was no weapon in her hand, no power visible to the human eye. But to those who were paying attention, it was clear. She wasn't fighting the beast. She wasn't even trying to hurt it. She was doing something else, something much more powerful. The soldiers, the alien woman, the Warbeast, all of them were in awe as they realized that this was no ordinary encounter. This wasn't just a battle. This was something far more profound. The child wasn't just standing her ground. She was bending the world around her, controlling the very energy that flowed through the city, through the battlefield, through the Warbeast itself. The Warbeast growled again. But this time, it was quieter, as if it was unsure. It had never encountered anything like this. The power of the child was undeniable. The question was no longer whether the child could defeat the Warbeast. It was whether humanity was ready to accept the truth of what this child represented. And the audience, just as the soldiers and the Warbeast waited, the world seemed to stop. The moment had arrived. What would the child do next? The air was thick with tension, and the silence that followed the child's raised hand felt like an eternity. The world seemed to pause, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The Warbeast, towering above the city in all its terrifying power, remained still. Its molten eyes glowed with an intensity that could melt stone. Yet there it was, frozen in place by something so small, so fragile in comparison. The soldiers, who had been bracing for another attack, stared in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had seen the beast tear through entire battalions, obliterate cities with a single swipe. Yet now, it was like a child was holding it back. A child. The thought didn't make sense. Yet there it was, right before their eyes. For a moment, nothing changed. The Warbeast's claws twitched, its immense body shifting ever so slightly as though testing the limits of the unseen force that held it in place. The child's hand remained extended, her face calm, her eyes unwavering. She seemed to know exactly what she was doing, like she had always been meant for this moment. The soldiers looked to one another, exchanging glances of confusion, fear, and hope. They had never witnessed anything like this before. Could a child really have this kind of power? It was unthinkable. Was it even possible? The military had fired everything they had at the beast, yet the child, with nothing but a simple gesture, seemed to have stopped it in its tracks. In the distance, the alien woman stood, watching intently. She knew exactly what was happening. Her eyes gleamed with a knowing light. But even she was waiting for the moment when everything would become clear. She could feel the power in the air, growing stronger by the second. She had seen it before, on distant worlds, in times long past. But this was different. This child, this human child, held a power that could change the course of everything. The Warbeast growled again, a low, rumbling sound that shook the ground. It was frustrated, its fiery eyes now narrowing as it tried to break free from the strange force that held it back. It was a creature of pure destruction, its very existence built to annihilate anything that stood in its path. But for the first time in its existence, It was facing something it could not understand. It had destroyed civilizations before, reduced entire cities to ash, but this child, this small, insignificant human child was something else entirely. With a sudden jolt, the Warbeast's massive body lunged forward, but the child didn't flinch. Her hand remained steady, as if anchored by an invisible force. The creature's claws, which had shattered buildings and ripped through metal like paper, now stopped in midair, unable to advance. The tension in the air was so thick it was almost tangible. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in a delicate balance. The soldiers watched, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the Warbeast hesitated once more, as though waiting for permission to move. And then the child spoke. One word, sit. It was a simple command, yet the effect was immediate and profound. The Warbeast, the creature that had torn through cities and crushed armies without a second thought, obeyed. Slowly, reluctantly, it sank to the ground, its massive form lowering until it was sitting before the child. As though it were some kind of tamed animal, the soldiers stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. How could this be? The Warbeast, which had defied every weapon, every defense humanity had thrown at it, was now sitting obediently in front of a child. The child, who had barely spoken above a whisper, had commanded this beast, this unstoppable force, to sit. It was a moment of absolute shock. The impossible had happened, and there was no explanation for it. The alien woman stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the child. The soldiers, still in a daze, slowly turned their attention toward her. They had all heard the stories, the ancient myths of powerful beings who could control the forces of nature. But this was real. This child was no ordinary human. There was something far deeper at play here. The woman spoke quietly, almost to herself. It's not just the child, it's the bond. She looked at the soldiers, who were still processing the scene. The Warbeast wasn't meant to destroy humanity. It was sent to test it, to see if humans could rise up against the impossible. The soldiers, still in disbelief, looked at one another. They had seen the devastation, the destruction this beast had caused. How could it have been a test? How could they have possibly passed? The child, the alien woman continued, is not just any human. She is the chosen one, the one who can command not just the Warbeast, but the very forces of nature themselves. She turned her gaze back to the child, her voice filled with quiet admiration. The child is the future of your people. The words sank in like a stone in water. The soldiers, stunned and overwhelmed, slowly began to understand what had just happened. The Warbeast, the most dangerous weapon ever to be unleashed on Earth, had been controlled by a child who had simply spoken one word. The military might of the world had been rendered useless, but in that single moment, humanity had discovered something far more powerful than any weapon. The Warbeast, once a symbol of destruction, was now sitting, subdued, like a pet at the child's feet. It was a scene so surreal, so impossible, that it almost didn't feel real. But it was real, and the world was beginning to realize that everything had changed. The child, her expression still calm and focused, lowered her hand. The Warbeast, obedient and still, remained where it was. The soldiers, still processing the events unfolding before them, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and fear. What had they just witnessed? As the child stood there, unscathed, the weight of the moment settled on everyone watching. The Warbeast had been defeated, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Humanity had learned that the true power was not in their weapons, not in their armies, but in something far more ancient, far more profound. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this child, with her mysterious connection to the forces of the universe, held the key to humanity's survival. And with that realization came a new, overwhelming question: what would happen next? The air was thick with tension, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel heavy. The Warbeast, once a terrifying force of destruction, was now seated obediently on the ground, its fiery eyes fixed on the child who had commanded it to sit. The ground beneath it still vibrated with the power of its immense body, but for the first time, there was a strange stillness in the chaos. The military, the soldiers, who had spent their lives preparing for moments like this, were at a loss for words. None of them understood what had just happened or how. Their weapons, their strength, their training, everything they had relied on was useless in the face of the child's command. The alien woman, who had been standing quietly on the sidelines, her expression unreadable, stepped forward again, her steps measured and deliberate. The soldiers didn't take their eyes off her. She was different, they could feel it. There was a power in her presence, a quiet strength that seemed to resonate with the very world around her. But it wasn't just her. It was the child. Something about the way she moved, the way she stood, made them realize that they were witnessing the birth of something far beyond their comprehension. The alien woman stopped in front of the child, her eyes locked on the young face before her. The child was still, her gaze never wavering from the Warbeast. There was no fear, no hesitation, only quiet control, as though she had known all along what she was capable of. The alien woman could feel the energy in the air, shifting around the child like an invisible force. It was a power the child wasn't even fully aware of yet, but it was there, undeniable, for a moment. The woman said nothing. She simply studied the child, her mind working quickly to understand the situation. She had seen this kind of power before, in distant corners of the galaxy, but never in a human. Humans had always been the underdogs in the grand scheme of the universe. They were resilient, yes, but they were no match for the ancient forces that existed beyond their understanding. And yet here was this child, standing against the most formidable force they had ever encountered, effortlessly commanding it with a single word. Finally, the woman spoke. "You don't fully understand what you've done, do you?" The child didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. She simply continued to stare at the Warbeast, her expression unchanging. The woman's words hung in the air, and the soldiers, still watching, felt a chill creep up their spines. They had seen armies fall before, but this was something else entirely. A child, a single human, had done what entire military forces could not. The Warbeast had not just been stopped. It had been tamed, controlled, like an animal obeying its master. "You have bound it." The woman continued, her voice low but filled with awe. "You have bent it to your will, just as the ancients once did." She turned her gaze back to the Warbeast, its fiery eyes now flickering in confusion, as if it were trying to comprehend what had just happened. This creature, it was never meant to destroy humanity. It was a test. The soldiers exchanged glances, their minds struggling to catch up with the words. A test. They had thought they were facing the end of civilization itself. And yet, here was the woman, calmly explaining that the Warbeast had never intended to destroy them. She was speaking as if the world was only now beginning to understand what was really at stake. "The Warbeast is a creation," she said. "It was sent to challenge humanity, to see if you could rise up against an impossible force. It wasn't here to conquer you, but to test your strength, your will. It was a test of humanity's spirit." The soldiers looked at each other in confusion. The Warbeast had already destroyed so many cities, so many lives. How could this have been a test? How could it be anything but a threat? The alien woman's gaze softened, as if she understood their confusion. "You don't see it yet, but you will." The child, still silent, stepped forward slightly. She moved with purpose, and the Warbeast, which had remained seated, slowly rose to its feet in response to her movements. The soldiers, who had been caught up in the alien woman's explanation, snapped their attention back to the child, watching as the massive creature obeyed her without question. They held their breath, not daring to make a sound. The child's face remained calm, her eyes still locked on the Warbeast. Then, as if to prove the woman's words true, she spoke again, her voice soft yet powerful. "Stand." The Warbeast obeyed, its enormous body rising once more, towering above the child as it stood. But it wasn't the same. There was no growl, no roar. The beast stood at attention, as if it were part of a larger order. The soldiers watched in awe, unable to look away from the impossible scene before them. The alien woman stepped to the side, watching the exchange between the child and the beast with a quiet smile. She knew this was just the beginning. The child had shown the world a glimpse of something that had long been forgotten. Something far more powerful than any weapon. The child was the key to humanity's survival, to their evolution, to their place in the universe. And yet, even now, humanity didn't fully understand the significance of what had just happened. The Warbeast was no longer a symbol of destruction. It was a symbol of humanity's potential. The child, with her unique ability, had bridged the gap between the known and the unknown. And in doing so, she had unlocked the door to a future far greater than anyone had imagined. The child finally turned her gaze away from the Warbeast, her eyes meeting the alien woman's. The unspoken understanding between them was clear. This was only the beginning. The world would never be the same again. The future of humanity rested in the hands of a child, and the question that remained was, what would they do with it? The Warbeast, now standing obediently by the child's side, seemed almost peaceful in comparison to the chaos it had caused. But the real battle was just beginning, not against the Warbeast, but against the unknown forces that had brought it to Earth. The child, with her newfound power, would have to face a future that none of them could predict, and the soldiers, the alien woman, and the entire world would have to decide where they fit into this new reality. For the first time in what seemed like forever, the city fell silent. The Warbeast was no longer a monster. It was a creature bound by the will of one human child, and the world, uncertain and fragile, could only wonder what would come next. The Warbeast stood motionless, as if waiting for the next command, its immense body still radiating heat, but now devoid of the destructive rage that had marked its arrival. The child's control over it was absolute, and the soldiers couldn't help but watch in awe, their minds racing to understand what had just transpired. The Warbeast, the monster they had feared, was now under the command of a small human child. It was impossible, unbelievable, and yet, there it was happening in front of them. The alien woman, her expression unreadable, stepped forward again, her presence commanding attention. The soldiers, who had been stunned into silence, turned their gazes toward her, their eyes filled with questions. She had explained that the Warbeast was a test, but what did that mean? Why had this creature of destruction been sent to Earth in the first place? And why had it been stopped by a child? The woman's eyes met the child's, and for a moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. There was something deeper at work here, something beyond what the soldiers, or even the Warbeast, could comprehend. The child was no longer just standing before them as a symbol of defiance. She had become a key to something much larger, a force that had the power to change the future of humanity. I told you before, the alien woman said, her voice calm but filled with an unshakable certainty. The Warbeast was never meant to destroy humanity. It was a test of humanity's potential. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But there's more. The Warbeast is not just a tool. It was a message. The soldiers exchanged confused glances, but no one dared speak. They waited for her to continue, desperate for clarity. The Warbeast was sent by an ancient civilization, the woman explained. A civilization that has observed humanity for eons. They wanted to see if humanity could rise above its primitive instincts, if it could embrace something beyond its limitations. They wanted to see if you could rise to your potential. The words felt heavy, like the air was thick with the weight of something too vast to fully understand. The soldiers, still trying to grasp the enormity of the situation, looked at the child, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were hearing with the reality before them. The child, standing silently, her face calm and composed, had become the focal point of the world's attention. She wasn't just an innocent bystander caught in the chaos. She was the catalyst for humanity's future. She had shown the world that humanity had power that went beyond technology, beyond weapons, beyond anything they had ever known. But the question still lingered. Why this child? Why was she the one chosen to wield this power? And what did it mean for the future of the Earth? The alien woman seemed to sense the question in the air. She glanced at the child, who stood still, almost as if listening to something far beyond the human realm. Then she turned back to the soldiers, her gaze unwavering. The child is part of an ancient lineage, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made every word feel significant. She is the descendant of those who once ruled this planet, long before your recorded history. The Warbeast was sent to test whether humanity could unlock the power of its ancestors. It is a power that has lain dormant for centuries. The soldiers felt a chill run down their spines as the implications of the woman's words began to sink in. The child was not just any ordinary human. She was the heir to a power that had been lost, forgotten. A power that could command the very forces of nature. A power that could control the Warbeast itself. It was a power that, if understood and embraced, could change the course of humanity's future. But there was more. The alien woman's expression darkened as she spoke again, her tone growing more serious. The Warbeast was a test, she said, but it was also a warning. There are forces in the universe, ancient and powerful, that do not want humanity to rise. Forces that will stop at nothing to keep you from realizing your true potential. The Warbeast was only the beginning. The soldiers stood still, their minds racing as the weight of the woman's words settled over them. It was as though everything they had known, their armies, their weapons, their defenses, had been built on a false foundation. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and the battles they had fought on Earth were nothing compared to the challenges they would face in the future. The Warbeast had been just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The child, still silent, turned her gaze toward the alien woman, and for the first time, the woman saw something in the child's eyes, a flicker of something ancient, something far beyond the human experience. The power that the child wielded was not just about the Warbeast. It was about humanity's place in the cosmos. The test had been passed, but only just. The future was uncertain, and the forces that watched from afar were waiting, watching to see what humanity would do next. There is still much to be done, the alien woman said softly, as though speaking to herself. The Warbeast was just the beginning. The real challenge will come when they arrive. The soldiers felt a cold shiver run through them at the mention of they. Who were these forces? What did they want? And how could humanity, a species that had barely begun to understand its own potential, stand against them? The child stepped forward, her hand moving slightly. The Warbeast followed her, obedient, as though awaiting her next command. The soldiers watched in stunned silence, knowing that they had just witnessed something that would change everything. The Warbeast, once a symbol of destruction, was now a symbol of something else, the future. A future that was no longer in the hands of the military, the governments, or even the alien woman. It was in the hands of this child, this young human, who had the power to shape the destiny of the world. As the child walked forward, the Warbeast following in her wake, the soldiers knew one thing for certain: the world had changed. The test was over, but the real story had only just begun. What would humanity do with this power? Would they rise to their true potential, or would they falter, trapped by their own limitations? The child's steps echoed in the silence, a quiet but undeniable declaration that the future was hers to command. The child stood in the center of the battlefield, her small frame casting a long shadow across the cracked and smoldering streets. The Warbeast, now calm and obedient, loomed behind her, its massive form towering over the ruined city. The soldiers, who had once been filled with fear and uncertainty, now watched in awe, their eyes filled with questions and a sense of disbelief. The alien woman, who had explained so much yet revealed so little, remained silently by the child's side, her gaze distant, almost as though she were looking far beyond the horizon, seeing something only she could understand. The city, once teeming with life, was now a ghost town, its buildings shattered, its streets filled with the debris of war. The sounds of destruction had faded into an eerie quiet, broken only by the soft hum of the Warbeast's presence and the occasional crackle of distant fires. But beneath this quiet, beneath the stillness that had descended, a storm was brewing, a storm of uncertainty, fear, and hope. The world had just witnessed the impossible, and now, the future hung in the balance. The child turned her gaze from the Warbeast to the alien woman, her expression still calm, still unshaken by the magnitude of the situation. It was as if she knew that the hard part wasn't over. The Warbeast had been tamed, but the true challenge, the real battle, was yet to come. The child's ability to control the beast, to bend its will with a single word, was something humanity could barely begin to understand. But what had it all meant? What was the purpose of this test? And what did the alien woman mean by saying the Warbeast was only the beginning? The soldiers, still in shock, began to move again. Slowly at first, they approached the child, unsure whether to feel grateful or fearful. They had witnessed the power of the Warbeast, and now they were witnessing the power of the child. But what did this power mean for them? For humanity? The child had commanded a force unlike anything they had ever faced. But could they truly rely on her to save them? Could anyone? The alien woman, sensing the growing unease among the soldiers, stepped forward and addressed them. Her voice was calm but filled with an undeniable authority, as if she were speaking not just to them, but to the entire world. "This is only the beginning," she said, her words carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. The Warbeast was sent to test humanity, but it was also a warning. There are others out there, forces far greater than anything you've ever known. The Warbeast was a small part of a much larger plan, a plan that began long before Earth was ever inhabited. The soldiers, though still shaken, listened intently. The words the alien woman spoke were impossible to ignore. They had heard rumors, whispers of ancient civilizations, of distant planets, of beings that existed beyond the reaches of human understanding. But now, with the Warbeast at their feet and the child standing before them as the master of it, the truth was undeniable. They were no longer alone in the universe, and the future, as uncertain as it was, would be shaped by forces far beyond anything they could imagine. The child, the woman continued, her gaze never leaving the child's face, is the key to humanity's future. She is not just a symbol of hope. She is the embodiment of what you are capable of. This is your moment, your test. Humanity has been given a chance, but it will be up to you whether you rise to the occasion. The soldiers looked at each other, their minds reeling. They had witnessed the destruction, the chaos, and the fear. They had seen the beast, the unimaginable force that could bring entire cities to their knees. But now, standing before them, was a child who had controlled it. The power they had always relied on their weapons. Their armies had been rendered useless in the face of this new reality. What was left for them? Where did they go from here? The child, sensing the weight of the questions in the air, took a small step forward. She was still, her movements precise, as though each step was calculated, as though she understood that every action she took was being watched. The soldiers, despite their fear, followed her gaze. It wasn't directed at them, though. It was directed at the Warbeast, which still knelt silently behind her, waiting for her next command. The child spoke again, her voice soft, yet carrying the authority of someone far older, far wiser than her years. "This Warbeast is not the enemy. It never was." The words hit the soldiers like a punch to the gut. The enemy. Who or what was the enemy? The Warbeast had been the threat, the unstoppable force that had nearly torn their world apart. But now, in the child's voice, it sounded almost familiar, like a piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. The alien woman's eyes softened, and she nodded, as if the child had just confirmed something she already knew. She looked at the soldiers once more, her gaze unwavering. "The real enemy is not the Warbeast," she said. "The real enemy is the fear that holds humanity back, the fear that you are not capable of greatness, the fear that keeps you locked in a cycle of violence and destruction. That is your true test. To overcome that fear, to step beyond it, and to realize that you are capable of more than you ever imagined." The soldiers stood in stunned silence. The weight of her words pressed down on them, each one carrying the burden of everything they had been taught, everything they had believed. But now, with the Warbeast tamed at the child's feet, they could see it. The fear, it wasn't the beast that was the enemy. It was the fear that held them captive, the fear of the unknown, the fear of their own potential. And then, for the first time, the child looked at the soldiers. Her gaze was calm, understanding, as though she knew exactly what they were feeling. There was no arrogance in her eyes, no sense of superiority, just quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from knowing the truth of who you are. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The Warbeast shifted behind the child, its enormous form moving with the grace of something not bound by fear, but by will. The soldiers, still watching, knew that they were at a crossroads. The child had shown them a future one that was no longer defined by the Warbeast, but by what they could become. The alien woman turned to the child, her voice filled with quiet approval. "It is time," and with that, the future of humanity began its new path. The Warbeast, the once feared monster, now stood as a symbol of what could be achieved when fear was set aside. The child had proved it, and humanity would have to follow her lead. The true battle, the one that would shape the destiny of the human race, was just beginning.